Well, that's an interesting question and something that I often stress in my workshops. The importance of recognising hot topics, determining what the latest threats are emerging in the fraud environment. What are the latest threats? Now, an example of this is the way that criminals have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with their typical characteristic ruthlessness and speed. So we've got new emerging threats in that particular area. We've got traditional types of fraud that we see increasing because of the situation with the pandemic, which serves as a useful example. One of these, the CEO fraud, business email compromise, a remarkable significant increase in the amount of the CEO fraud that's taking place and the loss and disruption to businesses as a result. But that's an external threat from the fraudsters. Something we also need to recognise with emerging threats is the risks surrounding our new products and services. So when we deliver a new product or service, when we're creating it and delivering it, we need to be carrying out a risk assessment and recognising what are the fraud risks about that. An example here, again, I think the pandemic provides us with a useful example. Banks have begun to issue connected cards. So to help those individuals who are self-isolating and relying on others to make purchases for them for their essential needs. So a connected card, a second card on the account, which can be given to a trusted individual, such as a family member or a carer, and they can go and purchase the goods for the account holder. Now, clearly, I think we'd all recognise that there are fraud risks around that. How do we mitigate those risks? Well, the issuing banks have implemented controls around that. So controls that they can only be used in store. For example, they can't be used online or over the telephone or anything. A control there, limits on the controls, the type of purchases that can be made as well. So an example there of an emerging threat with a new product and how that was dealt with. And I really think that understanding the latest threats, the latest fraud typologies, is vital in our as a defensive tool in our anti-fraud work. Criminals ensure they're flexible and act as quickly as situations unfold. Again, the pandemic is an example of that. The way I like to think of it is the criminals carry out a sort of opportunities assessment. So we may produce or deliver a new product. Before we do that, or part of implementing that product, providing it is to carry out a risk assessment. So we carry out a risk assessment on that product. What are the fraud threats around it? And as the way I look at it with this opportunities assessment, the criminals out there are carrying out an opportunities assessment. So here's something new. How can we use this to achieve our objectives within our criminality? So it is important for us to recognise that they are flexible and they act quickly and they are innovative. So they can respond. How can we respond to this as counter-fraud professionals? Well, I think it's useful to carry out an analysis of fraud trends during an example like the pandemic, to see exactly how the criminals reacted. How did they adapt? And we can separate that into two areas. How were they successful? As a business, can we learn from that? Did they adapt their communications? Did they adapt their networks quickly and effectively? We can learn something from that, maybe as a business. We can learn so that we know and we're prepared for the future. But also not forgetting in which ways were they unsuccessful. So if there was something that they tried to do but didn't achieve, then by analysing that, we can try and establish why they failed. And that could give us potentially opportunities for the future to use that as a vulnerability for the criminals and as a form of control. So recognising how criminals work can help us to anticipate frauds in the future, anticipate the way they're going to develop, and catch up with the systems and controls that we put in place. The key to this answer is a strong anti-fraud culture. Now, culture is more than just signing up to something. Culture is something within an organisation that's practical and instilled across all levels of the organisation, and this really is key. The awareness is an important part of an effective fraud management framework. And awareness, as fraud professionals, we should be engaging with everybody within our organisation and making them aware of the threats. And this awareness applies to everyone within the organisation. It applies from the new starter to the senior management team at board level. And there's certain parts of this that you wanted to emphasise. So embedding a zero tolerance approach to fraud within an organisation is important. But one thing, the most important areas I think, is underlining the danger that fraud poses to everyone within the firm. Now, an example that you could use to really bring this home is the impact of significant fraud upon a firm in terms of the financial impact. So the share price, for example, when we see mistakes made, when we see, for example, data breaches within an organisation, then almost inevitably there's a drop in share price. There's a financial damage caused to the organisation. And if you wanted to pick a fairly recent case example, with Capital One, a data breach with Capital One, 5% was the impact on the drop in share price. So awareness is really important, and how to get staff to engage. Certain areas of it really needs to be reinforced. And with more staff working from home, I think that's a particular area where there's a vulnerability in organisations that we need to engage staff with our counter-fraud controls. And we need to try and persuade people that the IT controls in the office environment need to be implemented in the domestic environment when somebody's working from home. Now, this applies to many areas of business processes, for example. During onboarding, the identification and verification processes we might now be going through remotely because staff are working from home. If we're going through it remotely, we need to have effective controls around that. So that's a business process. But also engaging staff with awareness and recognising the risks that pose from people working from home and using business company equipment. The company laptop, for example. The company laptop should only be used for company purposes. But how often do staff recognise what really, or understand what the risk is around that? If it's used for personal use, staff may be engaging and looking at websites and engaging in different activity online with organisations and sites that don't have the typical IT security features within that site. They could be accessing personal emails on their device. So if they open something with malware, it's the company device that potentially could be landed with that risk. And not forgetting on this that criminals will try and exploit every weakness. So they will try and use staff working remotely, for example, with business email compromises. They'll try and use phishing. They'll try and install malware. They will try and exploit weaknesses. So we really need to get staff aware and engaged within our fraud controls. Now, I often get asked this question. Again, I think culture is key. What's the anti-fraud culture within your organisation? Is it a strong anti-fraud culture? Do the senior management team take a holistic approach where fraud is placed within that financial crime compliance framework and it's tied in with money laundering and terrorist financing within that framework? Because fraud is intrinsically linked with money laundering and terrorist financing. Think of those money laundering cases where the objectives are achieved by identity theft, by opening accounts, gaining products in false details. And the terrorist financing examples where charities may be exploited and the almost inevitable part of that involves fraud. So the holistic approach, which is encouraged more by regulators around the world, is key, and that's a strong anti-fraud culture. The alternative to that is that there's a weaker culture where maybe counter-fraud is considered by senior management as being a credit risk, purely a credit risk. And the counter-fraud team themselves are considered as being a cost centre. So if that is the case, then we need to reverse that. And again, I'll mention awareness, because our awareness is important, and awareness right across the organisation, but now we're considering specifically with the senior management team. So how to make the senior management recognise the threat posed by fraud, convey the risks to them, convey the risks to the organisation, and even to them with individual accountability. The risks to the organisation, useful ones to consider, the most useful one I think for this purpose is the reputational risk. The reputational risk. There's more of an emphasis now on our vulnerable customers, which we've seen maybe a recent increase in the number of vulnerable customers, or those customers that qualify for that to be treated within that definition. And vulnerable customers, if we get that wrong, think of the reputational damage that could cause with the public. Think of the regulatory risk that poses, because the regulator has requirements for us to protect our customers. Failure with that may lead to enforcement action by them. So these sort of risks being conveyed to the management with awareness, I think, are useful. Another point I'd make is that I also think that it is useful to monetize events. So if there's a way that we can show that but for the action taken, there would have been this amount of loss, I think that's useful, because it shows the value of a counter fraud framework and team within it. Now, for example, I've visited one particular bank a number of times, and there's a large meeting room that's used by the senior management team and available to all staff and departments across the organisation. And when I walk into that room, the counter fraud team have secured some wall space. So the first thing you see when you go in there is a statement saying this is the amount that we've stopped of fraud against our organisation in the last 12 months. That sort of awareness, I think, is really useful. We've also got research that can be used to promote this idea. UK Finance, for example, have estimated that investment in security systems prevented £2 billion worth of unauthorised fraud in 2019. So this again ties in with a fraud awareness programme. But this can only be achieved by counter fraud professionals who are expert in their area, who understand what the threats are and can convey those threats within an awareness programme. And the key to that, I think, is learning and education. I think fundamental to overcoming all the issues that we've considered is understanding, being able to confront those issues with understanding of our threats, of our hot topics, of emerging threats. And this can be achieved by learning and education. Without it, none of the questions I've spoken about can begin to be addressed. Now, this learning, this subject matter expertise can be achieved in many different ways. It could be setting up email alerts, setting up specific Google search terms, for example. Email alerts, some that I would suggest, in the UK, the Fraud Advisory Panel, the industry bodies such as the UK Finance, law enforcement agencies as well, setting up email alerts with them. The latest cases, the latest enforcement cases, the latest things they're seeing. And with law enforcement, I've mentioned large organisations such as Europol. If we're considering cybercrime as an enabler for fraud, those cybercrime organisations, again, we can set up email alerts with them and find out what the latest is, whether that's in the UK, the National Cybercrime Security Centre, or in the United States, for example, the FBI. And also, email alerts and regularly researching the regulators and the activity by regulators. We can find out there what the latest trends are and the warnings that are being put out, particularly around areas such as investment fraud. And useful ones that I particularly use for my research in the UK, United States, Singapore, Australia are a couple. Engage in discussions with other counter fraud professionals, such as on LinkedIn. Engage in the discussions, join the groups on there. Absorb the latest reports and publications by the range of NGOs, of governments, of government agencies. Really useful. So a range of ways that we can achieve that subject matter expertise through those different processes, including experience of virtual classrooms and hot topic events and webinars such as those offered by ICA. Remember, criminals are unceasing and persistent in their attempts to engage and achieve fraud. For us as counter fraud professionals, if I could finish on one note, it would be never stop learning.